A lot of times people just kind of default to the same city that they're in. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And maybe you've got really deep roots already set there and that's where you want to be, and that's fine. But, I always tell people, think big, the world's your oyster. So if it's, where do you want to live? And the things you got to start thinking about are, what part of the country do you want to live in? Do you want to be close to the mountains? Okay. Nashville's not a great place for that. Do you want to be close to the beach? Okay. Kansas is not going to work for you. Think about proximity to family. Do you want to be close to family, or do you really, really not want to be close to family? You got to think about that. Those are reasonable things to consider. Consider cost of living. That's something that people don't take into account.
Welcome to today's episode of the Providers, Properties, and Performance podcast, where I interview Dr. Brent Lacy, who's an MD, gastroenterologist with Texas Digestive Disease Consultants, and he has started a practice called the Scope of Practice, where he consults with other clinicians on their personal finances, and especially when they are considering opening up a private practice. So welcome to Brent, and thank you for joining. So Brent, welcome to the Providers, Properties, and Performance podcast.
Oh, hey, thanks, Trisha, for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So just so the audience knows, you are an MD, gastroenterologist with Texas Digestive Disease Consultants, and you founded the business, The Scope of Practice.
Yeah, I can't resist a good dad joke. So that's how that name came about.
Well, what inspired you to become an entrepreneur and start advising clinicians on financial independence through your business, The Scope of Practice?
Well, it's funny. I never feel like I got a spark to become an entrepreneur. I'm a teacher at heart. My primary spiritual gift is teaching, and that's what I've really always been since I was a really little kid. I used to coach people on homework stuff. I was a teaching assistant in college and in medical school. And, I've been a teacher my whole life. And so that's kind of how I think of myself. I'm a physician by trade, but I'm a teacher by, just my personality. And so I cut my teeth on financial coaching with Dave Ramsey's classes, so like Financial Peace University. I taught that at my church, I think 13 times. Over the course of a few years, and really enjoyed it, and just loved getting to see those light bulb moments when someone goes, "Oh, I think I know how to dig myself out of this hole now," and it was great. I loved it, and I kind of just fell into it because I started getting asked by some people who were at my church who also worked at my hospital, "Hey, like we would love to have you come and talk to the OR nurses about how do we set up our retirement funds." Or, and then I went and did that. And then some of the corpsmen, I was in the military at the time. So some of the corpsmen, which is like the Navy equivalent of medics, asked, "Hey, can you come and talk to one of our clinics? We got a bunch of people that love to hear this," and had a huge number of people that came. The students and the residents started getting asked, like, "We want to get in on that." And so I started realizing, man, there's a huge galloping need here. And frankly, the financial questions that I was getting were all basically similar from person to person, regardless of age or career status or wealth status, income level, socioeconomic status. It was all the same 5 or 6 questions. And I started thinking, I keep getting all the same questions. It'd be great if I had a blog or something. I could just point people to an article and say, "Hey, I wrote a whole thing about this. Just go check it out." And then I started thinking, "Hey, why don't I just have a blog about stuff like this?" And so I was like, what does it take to even create a blog? What do you even do for that? So I got on YouTube and started looking up some tutorials and looking at what other people had done. I was like, okay, I'll put some stuff together that could be a useful tool, and found that I really liked it. And people started reading it and started reaching out to me. And I was like, there is a galloping need for this. People just are craving this help and this encouragement. And it's like, I can do a lot of good here. So I started looking for more ways to try to help people. That's, if you're a teacher, that's what you do. It's like, I helped one person. So now how do I help 25 more?
Right.
How do I help 2,500 more? And so then over time, I added the podcast and, formalized financial coaching. And now I've got some online courses, and we've got a summit that's coming up this fall. So a lot of great stuff coming on. So it kind of grew, but from that kernel of passion that comes from the heart of a teacher.
Well, and now, so your clients are all clinicians of some sort. So you've kind of narrowed in helping them and giving them advice on operating their own medical practice and financial strategies for their personal investments.
Yeah, for the most part, I still do a lot of coaching at my church with our deacons and our benevolence ministry. I still do a lot of that, and it's amazing how similar the challenges and the questions are. It's so funny. The widow who's on Social Security that is making 13.5 a year from Social Security. She makes the same mistakes. They ask the same questions as the dermatologist making 600 grand. What I always tell docs is that doctors make the same dumb mistakes as everybody else. We just do it with more zeros on the end. So, but yeah, and I've gradually branched into, coaching people on, business management strategies, leadership. That's really my true passion, I think, is really helping turn physicians into the leaders that their companies need them to be. I really enjoy that.
So when a client comes to you about opening a private practice, what's the first question you ask them?
So one of the first questions I ask is why? Because for me, it's very helpful to have an understanding of someone's motivation. And sometimes what I find is that they kind of need to be talked out of it. Sometimes they need to be talked into it, but sometimes they need to be talked out of it. And what I mean by that is that some people are feeling burnt out in their current job, and they're frustrated, and they don't like their boss, or they don't like their they don't like their team leader, they don't like their staff, they don't like their hours or whatever. They're just frustrated about it, and they're like, well, it'd be so much better if I was just out on my own. And I tell them, what, the grass isn't always greener. So you need to have something you're running to, not something you're running from. And so that's the first thing I always ask. Second question I always ask is, where do you see yourself 10 years from now? Where do you see yourself 15 years from now? Because I think a lot of people maybe get allured by the idea of doing private practice, but don't have a really appropriate appreciation for just how much work it is. And what I always tell people is, like, this is going to be a lot of work, and it's going to be worth it, but it's going to be a lot of work. So you need to make sure you're really motivated for this. You're really on board for it. And then, once we do that, it's usually a matter of trying to figure out where people are. Because a lot of times people have already been pretty in depth in thinking about it. It's by the time someone's coming to me, a lot of times they've already got a plan. They're thinking, okay, well, I really want to do private practice. I've been talking with this one nurse that's going to come with me, or I've been talking with one of my buddies. We're going to open up shop together. Or sometimes they've gone so far as, like, I think we've picked out a piece of property. Or I think we're going to lease this one space or whatever. And so just then we start to figure out, okay, where are you now? And then how do we, keep progressing along the lines? Let's set up a real business plan, right? So how do we figure out where you're going to set up shop? Who are you going to hire? What kind of equipment do you need? And you start getting into the nitty gritty at that point.
And do you think that they're aware of, depending on that the operating the business is going to cut into or require them to have a second job in order to do both, but their ability to see as many patients? Do you have that conversation with them?
Yeah, and that all comes when we start developing the business plan. It's helpful to get it down to a specific number. And one of the things that's kind of nice about medical practice is that you can calculate it to a certain degree. So if you know what your monthly expenses are, you can figure out what your break-even point is. Okay. So if you have a dollar amount that is your break-even point, then you got to translate that into how many RVUs is that, or how many patient visits is that, how many operations, how many procedures is that. And then once you start to break it down into real numbers, you can see, okay, so that means in order to be making any kind of salary at all, I need to be seeing X number of patients. If I'm going to make, some extra profit, I need to be seeing Y. If I'm going to, maintain payroll, then my floor is this, right? And so, so it's all about getting down to a place where you can really estimate what your numbers are going to be. And so, yeah, and a lot of times it's kind of eye opening for folks, because they'll sit there and go, man, you mean I got to be seeing 30 patients a day to make this work out? I'm like, yeah. Yeah, you do. Or you got to figure out a way to lower expenses, or you got to figure out a way to bring in alternate sources of revenue. And a lot of times that really kind of gets the juices flowing. And sometimes they go, okay, when they start to chill a little bit, they're like, maybe I'm not quite as ready as I thought I was. Or they start to think, okay, well, maybe I'm not ready to make this leap. So I like the analogy of getting the boat close to the dock before you jump off it, right? So you're currently in a boat, you're gonna go jump onto the dock, and if you do it from 100 feet away, you're not gonna make it, right? But if you get a little bit closer to the dock, then you're gonna do better. So so if you are thinking about moving into a private practice and you're just gonna start cold, you're like, I'm gonna quit my job today, I'm gonna open up, I'm gonna see 30 patients tomorrow. No, that's not going to work. So there may be ways to ease into it. So maybe you start small, maybe you start without significant equipment, significant staff. You just start, putting out some feelers, start getting some name recognition, but maybe you go part-time in your job before you start moving over, but there's lots of different, or maybe you're doing locum tenens 2 weeks a month, and then you're building your practice the other 2 weeks a month. There's lots of different ways that you can start to build it, but it's really helpful for people to have a thorough understanding of what they're getting into before they start.
Well, and when a clinician comes to you and wants to continue to practice, they're like they express, I really want to continue practicing medicine. So what do you recommend as the first staff member that they hire in order to allow them to continue practicing?
So it's interesting you ask it that way. What I tell people is the first person they need to hire is themselves. And that sounds like a weird answer, but what I think happens a lot of times, and one of the reasons why a lot of people will burn out, is that as physicians we tend to we have a natural inclination, I think, to want to take care of everybody else before us. Doctors make the worst patients. I mean, we're so bad at taking care of ourselves. And I think that that's true in a business sense too. And I find a lot of docs that will, they'll come in and they're 6 months into their practice, they're a year into their practice, and they're just making no salary. And I'm looking at all their stuff going, okay, so why are you buying all this equipment? Why are you buying all these extra things? Like, I'm trying to expand the business. I'm trying to offer these more services. I'm like, yeah, but your kids need to eat, man. So you got to pay yourself something. And so they don't think of that. And I tell them, look, you got to get into a headspace where you are not only okay with, but you recognize the absolute necessity of paying yourself first. Because if you're not taking care of you, you're going to burn out so fast, you're not going to be able to take care of anybody else. That's your patients and your staff as well. So the first person they need to hire is going to be themselves. They have to think of themselves as someone that needs to be paid and is worthy of being paid. After that, it depends a little bit on what type of practice that you're starting. If you're starting a surgical type practice, one person isn't enough. You have to hire an army, right? So because you're going to need nurses, OR techs, MAs, front desk, medical records, all these things. But I think a good sort of initial cadre of people to have would be a nurse, a medical assistant of some kind, and some kind of administrative person. And that's a pretty good core if you're starting out really small. So the administrative person can serve as, reception, medical records, bill paying. They can kind of be a jack of all trades when you're starting off early. As you start to grow and expand, and that job becomes more than one person can handle, you split that into two jobs. You have one person who's reception and answering the phones and scheduling, and you have another person who's doing medical records and insurance and billing. And then when that gets to be more, you're getting more and more patients and you're expanding and you're adding services, now that's too many, and you start to create new jobs. So you allow the expansion to happen organically. One of the things that I think people do really very frequently, and I think that as physicians, we're really prone to stepping in this bear trap, is thinking that debt needs to be a way of life or just is a way of life. And so, you start to hire a bunch of people or buy a bunch of equipment or lease a bunch of space, and you're like, whatever, I know I'm going into debt. It's okay. I'm a doctor. I can make money. I can pay it back. Maybe if it all works out, but we're so numb to the idea of debt because we spend a decade to a decade and a half with our student loans hanging around our neck like an albatross, and we just can't pay it back because we're not making any money in training. And so then you start to think of debt as just a way of life, or even as a tool that you should use all the time. And so I always encourage people, don't feel bad about starting small. Do not despise humble beginnings. It's okay to start small and then even grow fast if you need to. But the smaller you think in terms of expansion, the smaller the size of the errors. So if you go big on hiring, you go big on spending, you can crash big when something just doesn't work out for you.
When I know a lot of your clients are early to mid careerists, so when they talk, so when we move into my world a little bit, and talk about where they're going to practice, you mentioned a good, I think, for your clients, a great option of doing like the locum tenens, or try and find temporary space and build up their patient base, and then from there move into permanent space. But when they say, when they start, discussing with you, where should I practice? What do you recommend how to approach that?
Yeah. So I start with a 10,000 foot view and ask them, what city do you want to practice in? What region of the country do you want to practice in? Because it may not be the place where they're currently living. And a lot of times people haven't thought about that very much, especially if you're talking about someone that's either they're just starting out, maybe they've been a hospitalist for a couple of years and now they're saying, okay, I think I'm ready to go and open my own place. Or maybe they're fresh out of training, or maybe it's, they've been in an academic setting and they're saying, okay, I think I'm tired of research. I want to do something different. A lot of times people just kind of default to the same city that they're in. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And maybe you've got really deep roots already set there, and that's where you want to be, and that's fine. But, I always tell people, think big, the world's your oyster. So if it's, where do you want to live? And the things you got to start thinking about are, what part of the country do you want to live in? Do you want to be close to the mountains? Okay. Nashville's not a great place for that. Do you want to be close to the beach? Okay. Kansas is not going to work for you. Think about proximity to family. Do you want to be close to family, or do you really, really not want to be close to family? You got to think about that. Those are reasonable things to consider. Consider cost of living. That's something that people don't take into account. I mean, if you're living in Anaheim, and you're at an academic center in Anaheim, and you're just barely scraping by with being able to make the rent, and you're looking up and going, okay, so now I need to figure out a way to make enough money to, with my new business, to cover all my expenses. It's going to be a lot harder to do that in Orange County, California, than it's going to be in, say, Texas or Florida or Tennessee. So those kinds of things really need to be taken into account. So once you figure out kind of a region of the country and you start thinking critically about that, then it's a question of, a few different things. So how close do you want to be to the hospital that you're going to be working at? Okay. Assuming that you're going to be doing some coverage at the hospital. Well, your commute needs to be taken into account. You want to start thinking about school districts in the area. Do you want to be close to a good school district, or is it enough for you to live in a good school district, but you want to commute to a different area where there's just more dense population? So those are all kinds of things that you need to start taking into account. And where one of the things that I think is really helpful at this point is for people to start enlisting the services of a professional like yourself. Is, especially if you don't know the area very well, or you've never really searched for real estate, there is a lot of stuff that we don't know, right? So I don't try to do my own surgeries, right? I'm a gastroenterologist. If I need help with a surgery, if I need a gallbladder to come out, I call a surgeon. I call someone who's specialized in that. And so it's okay to reach for help. So if you are out there and you're thinking, I think I want to look for a place, call someone like Trisha, and get someone who's got some real expertise, who can really coach you through that. You're about to buy, a 6 to 7 figure asset potentially. Don't play around with that. Okay. Make an informed decision.
Absolutely. And if you get somebody that, maybe they've been in practice for a couple of years and they're looking to take it to the next level, and they're like, what, I now want to go out and I want to buy my own building and occupy it. What do you say to them versus, leasing and versus owning, if they approach that from a financial perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it massively depends on where they are in their financial life and in the life of their business. So I think early on, it makes a lot of sense to lease. As a long-term solution, I think it makes a lot more sense to own. So it's very similar to my attitude towards residential real estate. So when people are in residency and fellowship and early in their career, I advise renting. It frustrates people. And it's like, but I'm just throwing money away. I just want to buy a house. I want to start building equity. I'm like, you're not going to build equity for a long time just based on the amortization schedule. You're not going to be making, a lot of progress there. What you're buying or what you're losing is maybe a little bit of investment returns or a little bit of equity buildup. But what you're gaining is really excellent flexibility. And that's what you want early on, is you want choices. As you're growing and as you're expanding, you want to be able to make some big moves if you want. So if you start off with just you, and then in 3 years, you've got 4 partners and a staff of 20 people, you're going to outgrow your space. Right. And so if you've owned that space for 3 years, you're probably not going to end up making a whole lot of money after you figure closing costs and that sort of thing. So early on, I think leasing's great, especially, and I'll tell you, as another thing, is it really helps you figure out what you want. Right. So like for my wife and I, when we were buying our first house, it was very helpful to us to have lived in rentals for several years before that, because it gave us an opportunity to make a much more informed decision, because we were able to think of, okay, well, these are some things we definitely want in a house based on our experiences in the past. We want this for the backyard. We want this kind of line of sight. We want this, this level of security. We want this type of neighborhood, right there. Those are all questions that you don't necessarily know the answer to until you've just lived it for a while. So I think leasing early on is very good, but I think looking towards ownership as a long-term solution is really valuable, because you will make more money in the long term that way. It's a great investment. It's a great investment in yourself, especially if you're going to build a space and then lease it to yourself. That is an awesome way to go. I love that. I love that move. We've done that move in our group several times. We'll build a space, lease it to ourselves, and the person, and then we sell it some years later, and then, it's worth a lot to an investment like a real estate investment trust, because they have a long-term tenant, namely us. Right. And we've done very well with that strategy. So I think owning is great in the long term. I think leasing in the short term buys you patience, and that's massively worth it.
So using your example, because this is what some investors offer, especially groups like yourselves. And so tell me how attractive this may or may not be. But, when they buy a practice like yours, and, your practice is very large. So you have people in different phases of their career. But say, someone is like, what, I want to sell, but my share of the proceeds, I'd like to put back into this building, because I know this practice is going to survive and be here for a long time. So they become a passive real estate investor, but they still get the benefits of owning it, obviously a smaller portion, but they don't have to actively manage it either. So how do you feel about that sort of scenario?
Yeah, in general, I like it. I think it depends a little bit, on what kind of hassle factor you're willing to put up with. So if you're going to be an active versus a passive investor, but I will say that in general, if you have the opportunity to invest in a business that you own, so let's say, for example, you're buying shares in a piece of real estate that your group operates out of. Well, I mean, if you guys are all, lazy and shiftless and don't make any money for then it's not going to be worthwhile. But
no, it has to be a proven owner, obviously, that has done this before, can offer some references. Oh, absolutely. So qualifying that, they've done this before and they're not just offering it as, their first time out.
Sure. Absolutely. So for that kind of thing, I think it's great. We've done that several times. And, one of the things that's really valuable about it is that it takes some of the uncertainty out of the situation. So if you're going to put in a different tenant in an office building, maybe they're going to be good, maybe not. It's hard to know. But if you know the quality of your work and your business is making profits year after year, you're a really solid tenant. You're going to be getting rental income. That is a really nice, steady, passive income stream, and that can be very valuable, especially as you start thinking about the situations like the COVID shutdown or recessions. When all of a sudden things are going to change, diversifying into different income streams can be tremendously valuable.
Well, and one of the things that I find some of my clients are very comfortable with investing in healthcare properties because I think the first thing is when you are investing in something, it has to be something you understand. And, a physician can look at the tenant mix and understand if the tenants are, make sense in a building, if it's going to be an ecosystem that survives because of the referrals that they can pass along. So would you think that investing in healthcare properties is a little easier for a physician to understand and more feeling comfortable doing because they can really understand the investment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that when you're first starting out, there's an element of the unknown that is going to be true no matter what sector of real estate you're going to be investing in. So there's going to be a little bit of we don't know what we don't know. But I think there is some validity to the idea that we may feel a little bit more comfortable simply because we work in the healthcare space. So we are at least more familiar with, what's the typical turnover rate, what's the likelihood that a practice is going to stay, what's the typical profit margin of, say, a family medicine practice versus an ambulatory surgery center, what kind of investments are required, what kind of returns are we likely to get. So I think there are some aspects of it that are easier, but honestly, this stuff isn't that hard to figure out. You just got to start learning it. You just got to go, read books, listen to lectures, listen to podcasts like Doc Properties, things like that. And so you can learn this stuff. The stuff's out there, but yeah, whether it's easy or not, it is definitely worth it from a financial perspective. And so, if you don't know about it, go learn about it because it's worth it.
All right. So we're going to get into a little bit of your story. So how did you decide to become a physician? And then specialize in gastroenterology?
So I went to college as a business major, and I was planning on going into marketing. I've always been a writer. I love writing, probably one of the things that drew me to writing the blog and creating the podcast. But I started off as again, planning on going into marketing. And then my freshman year of college, I went on a medical mission trip to Mexico with the medical school in Dallas. And I just went as a translator. I speak Spanish. So I went as a translator, and really felt that week that God was calling me to a medical practice, really calling me into the medical field, and couldn't shake it. And so about 2 weeks later, I'd been thinking about it, praying about it, talking to my folks about it, and changed my major to pre-med and crammed the entire 4 years of pre-med into the last 3 years of college, which is not a strategy I generally advise for people. But it was great. I never looked back, and I've been incredibly happy with it. As for GI, I liked GI ever since I started learning it in my first year of med school. I just found the diseases to be fascinating. I think the liver is infinitely interesting. And, we take care of really, really sick people and get an opportunity to do some real good. I have a lady that I just saw today that has acute hepatitis B, which is incredibly unusual in our area. And, but we figured it out, and she's going to get better. And man, she was just, the look on her face when I gave her a big hug, you can't get enough of that. I mean, I can't imagine giving that up.
No, absolutely. So I'm gonna, since I have kind of the source, as I would call you, with regard to some questions here and with regard to healthcare and private practice, but do you think that in 20 years, more physicians will be employed or in private practice?
And that's a great question. The ratio shifted to be majority employee physician in 2018. It was the first year that it was over 50%. I think there's going to be, I think if you include things like locum tenens and, concierge practice, direct primary care, things like that, I think it will start tilting a little bit private practice in the next few years. What's going to be interesting is to see whether or not the private practice companies or the different private practice businesses will be able to withstand the wave of hospital organizations and big healthcare companies that are buying up all these little practices and absorbing everybody. That's the thing I think is going to be the real challenge. It's not going to be so much individual physicians wanting to start private practices. It's going to be, existing private practices that get bought up and get absorbed into corporate healthcare. So I don't know, it's going to be hard to stop that corporate machine, but I'm going to keep fighting the good fight and encouraging people to go into private practice. I love it. I love the
Mhm.
autonomy. I love the flexibility. I love that I don't have, the whips of my masters behind me or anything like that. I mean, if I'm not going to work one day, I'm just not going to work that day. I mean,
Yeah.
but I can't do that. I have to work every day because otherwise I go crazy. but it's one of those things that it's there for the taking. And I think if more physicians really understood what the like how reachable that goal is, I think more people would start to do it. And I certainly hope that we get more people encouraged to do that over the years.
So this might be a big question, but because I don't know if there's one thing, but if you could start with one change in healthcare to improve it, what would you address?
Um, I think the thing that I would want to impress upon people is that um, a funny thing has happened, I would say, over the last 20 years. Healthcare has started to be thought of as a commodity. And I think that's true to a certain extent, but the extension that has happened that I think is not good is that people start to think of all healthcare as being the same.
Mhm.
And that is a really, really mistaken worldview that I think has the potential to cause some really dumb policy moves, and has probably caused some dumb policy moves in the last 20 years. So, for example, so you're a realtor, right? So you have a lot of experience doing commercial real estate. I would bet my next paycheck against your next paycheck that there's a list of, I don't know, 5, 10, maybe 50 people who are realtors in your city that you would never ever recommend someone go to, ever, because they're just not very good, or they're swindlers, or they're just not knowledgeable, or they've made stupid mistakes, right?
Mhm.
And truth is, it's the same in healthcare. So not all physicians are the same level of quality. Not all hospitals are the same. Not all private practices are the same. And I think the conflation of healthcare as a universal good, with the idea that there is universal in non-varying levels of excellence, is mistaken and wrongheaded. And I think it's going to lead to some potentially very nasty changes as we start to see people want to demand various levels of service that frankly can't be provided at the cost that people want it to be.
Right.
And so I think that's probably the biggest change that I would make. And if I could figure out a way to just end all disease forever, that would probably be the number one. But
Right.
but this is reality. So
Right. Yeah. All right. So we're going to get into the Q&A. What was your first job?
my first job, I was a soccer referee in high school. And then and really close to that, I was on staff at a Boy Scout camp for 6 summers. But yeah, my first real job was as a youth high school soccer referee. And oh my goodness gracious, you have not seen. I mean, so if you've ever been to a dog fight, which I haven't, but I can only imagine that it must be very similar to a 12-year-old soccer game, just given what you see with the parents on the weekends. So that was
Oh,
my
yeah.
first job.
I know. That's unfortunate. Um, what would you be doing for a living if you were not a physician?
It's gonna sound crazy. My dream someday would be to open up my own miniature golf course.
I like that.
Yeah, I love miniature golf. It's just a lot of. I don't play regular golf. I've played 1.7 rounds of golf in my life, and I was terrible. But you put me in front of a windmill, man. I'm like Tiger Woods in his early years. I can hit that shot every time.
Bank it off of one thing and down
Oh
those
yeah.
complicated traps. That's fun.
Oh yeah. Forget about it.
What or who are you reading or listening to right now for news, information, or inspiration?
um. So I try to read at least one leadership or business management book a month. This last couple months I've been on call a lot and haven't really been able to do that. But I can give you a few different ones that I think are really good. Anything by Jim Collins is fabulous. I've read his stuff a couple of times. So he wrote Good to Great and Built to Last, which are, I think, absolutely pivotal books that every business owner needs to read. The leadership concepts, the business concepts he espouses in those books are heavily backed by research and exceptionally brilliant. So anything by Jim Collins is really good. Simon Sinek, Start With Why, I think is a really, really strong motivator. Love that one. Anything by John Maxwell, I think a good one to start with is the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, is just phenomenal. I mean, is incredibly insightful. And so, and then, for news, I don't know. I try not to watch the news. I mean, if I want deep, dark, depressing thoughts of nothingness and sadness, I watch Martin Scorsese movies.
Oh, that's funny. Those are actually good though.
Yeah, exactly. Why I watch those and not the news.
Yeah. What is one thing you do every day for healthy self-care?
Spend time with my kids, spend time with my wife. That's the number one. So when I get off work at the end of the day, I go home, cell phone goes in a drawer, and my doctor hat comes off. I'm dad, I'm husband, and it's like, hey, let's go play baseball. Let's go build so this week I took some cardboard boxes home, and my kids made a rocket ship and a telephone booth from Harry Potter. So,
yeah,
that's
I know. I would say to any new parent, skip the expensive toys, just let the Amazon boxes go around and let it entertain them for a while. So do you think a person is born with the desire to heal, or is this learned through their medical training?
I think that, as far as physician motivation, I think that it's more a desire to help. I think physicians are naturally inclined to be helpers. I think they're naturally inclined to be teachers to a certain degree. And I think the healing is kind of an extension of that. And I find that a lot of the times, not all the time, but I think a lot of the times the physicians that I've worked with, they had some kind of an experience that really got them motivated to the medical field specifically. They've always been sort of geared towards helping, but they broke their ankle when they were, in 7th grade, and they had a great physical therapist who worked with them, and that inspired them. Or, the person, there was a guy in their scout troop who was a physician who was just a real mentor, or, someone at church that they really looked up to who was in OBGYN or whatever. So, so I think to a certain extent that is probably shaped somewhat by our experiences, but I think all physicians are inclined towards helping and towards service.
I like that. Well, thank you, Brent. This has been a wonderful interview. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me on, Tricia. And if people want to get more reading, get more stuff, feel free to check me out. I'm at thescopeofpractice.com, and all my stuff's on there for free. And you're going to be on my podcast soon, so people
Yes.
Definitely need to go check that out.
I'm excited. Yeah, I'll have all of your web address and all of those links for people to find.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.